All right, so hi guys, and welcome to the Poker Strategy Fixed Limit Advanced Coaching. That's my name. Now, today I have a slightly different plan from something that we've done in the past, which is to do presentations, to do live play sessions. We may play live later on, um, but today what I wanted to do was have you guys develop an entire pre-flop strategy for open raising on the button. Now, I expect this to be a challenge for me and for you guys as well, because it's something that we haven't done yet, right? But based on some of the other pre-flop strategy that I've shown you guys using the kind of method that I like to look at, the kind of questions you guys were asking were suggesting to me that you would really benefit from looking at, building this thing from the ground up. So basically what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you guys some questions, right? We're going to go through this step by step, and you guys are going to develop the strategy, the entire strategy. So the plan today is we're going to be looking at button open raising, right? This will be advanced fixed limit strategy. And the first question we want to ask ourselves is, how do we justify an open raise on the button? And now that's a question for you guys, right? So you're on the button, you're dealt some hand, right? And you're trying to decide whether or not you want to enter the pot. How do you make that decision? If anybody wants to throw out some ideas, that would be excellent. Yep. How likely are the blinds to fold? So we need to look at some probabilities, right? So that'll be something like reads, right? And we can represent that by P fold. Pretty important stuff there. If our opponents are more likely to fold, then we're more likely to win the blinds, right? Now, what does that suggest, right? We're looking at probabilities. Probabilities are mathematical, right? So at the base of it, we're really justifying these decisions using mathematics, right? Yeah, if we have a blind who's entering the pot a lot, right? But let's say we want to think more generally. Let's say we want to be able to have an ability to look at every situation, right? Not just if our opponents are tight, not if they're maniacs and three betting a lot, right? Not if they're even completely average. We want to have something that's flexible enough to tackle every situation. And to do that, we're going to have to use something more general. We're going to be using some general mathematical ideas. So let's move on to our next question here. When we open raise, what can happen? What are the options, right? We've open raised. We've made our decision to enter the pot by raising. What are the different kinds of things that can happen when we do this? We can have one or more callers. Yeah. Okay. And so what that means is one or more players can enter the pot, right? For sure. If we think generally, right? At least one player entering the pot. So we could say the small blind can 3-bet us, and we can play heads up versus the small blind, right? Another situation would be the big blind continues, right? And we're heads up against the big blind. And we want to be able to account for those two situations. Now, what's kind of the third one, right? We've got a situation where the small blind enters the pot and continues. A second situation where the big blind is continuing. And then Raf says here the big blind can cap. So we can have a third situation where the big blind enters the pot after the small blind enters the pot, right? So we have three separate probabilities here, right? We have, some probability that when faced with our open raise, the small blind is going to enter the pot and the big blind is going to fold, given that the small blind has entered the pot, right? That's option one. Then we have option two, where the small blind folds, right? And given that the small blind folds, the big blind decides to continue, right? And then we have this third scenario where the big blind and the small blind both continue, where the small blind 3-bets and the big blind decides to come along, right? either by calling or capping. And we're going to think generally enough where we'll look at the situation where calling and capping and assume they're the same. We're going to look at all of those pot sizes. But there's a fourth situation, right? And I haven't seen it listed anywhere yet. What's the fourth situation that can occur when we open raise? Both fold, exactly, right? We win the blinds. Okay, so we have four scenarios. And why don't we just kind of start by creating a couple of tables here. That one looks nice. Oh, select an area. Now we're probably going to need quite a few variables in order to look at this whole thing. So I'm going to make a nice big table. If we have to make changes to it, that's fine. Okay, now column 1 will be a description. And what we want to be describing here is the scenario, right? We've just described 4 of them, but we're going to have more, right? So let's say the first scenario is both fold, right? Now, for this to happen, we need 2 certain things to occur. We need the small blind to fold, right? And let's call the probability that the small blind folds X, right? And we need the big blind to fold as well. Let's call the probability that the big blind folds given that the small blind folds, we'll call that Y. So X times Y is the probability that both players fold. Simple enough, right? Now, we'll give this a variable name. We can put that here. And we'll just call this situation A, right? We'll think really general. We'll just call it A. And eventually we'll be calculating that and putting that here as our data. And I don't know why we have a 5th column. We'll see. Maybe we'll use it, maybe we won't. So we have more situations. We have this situation where the small blind 3 bets and the big blind folds given the 3 bet. Now, how would we represent this, right? The small blind didn't fold. If we have the probability that the small blind folds being X, right? How would we write that if we wanted to say, well, he didn't fold? What is the opposite of X? 1 minus X, exactly. So here, right, the probability that the small blind 3 bets and the big blind folds is going to be equal to 1 minus X, right? And now, how do we put in the probability that the big blind folds given that the small blind has 3 bet, right? Because it's not X, right? And it's not Y, right? Y is the probability that the big blind folds given that the small blind folded. But the small blind didn't fold. Something else has gone on here. So if we want to represent the probability that the big blind enters the pot or folds after the small blind has decided to 3 bet here, we could represent the probability he folds in this scenario with something like Z, right? So we've got our X, our Y, and our Z. X is equal to the probability the small blind folds. Y is equal to the probability the small blind or the big blind folds given the small blind folds. And Z is the third one, the probability that the big blind folds given that the small blind has not folded. Now we're going to call this whole situation B, right? Because as we've just pointed out here, this is one of our scenarios, one of our 4 scenarios, right, that can occur pre-flop. So let's carry on from there. Now, the next one we might want to look at is where the small blind folds and the big blind doesn't fold. He continues in the pot. Now, how would we write that? Small blind folding is X, right? And the small blind, or in the big blind not folding, we've seen an example of this already. If we wanted to write what is the probability that the big blind doesn't fold, how would we write it? Boomer's got it there. Yeah, X times 1 minus Y. Now, I can understand at this point that this might look like it's going to get really technical, but I'm going to do my best to try and break it down at different points so it's nice and easy and laid out for you guys. And basically, to restate our goal here, what we're doing is we're trying to come up with a way of calculating exactly how much equity we need to open raise from the button. And that's kind of our long-term goal here. So fourth scenario, we've already got the situation where they both fold. We've got a situation where the small blind 3-bets and the big blind folds. We've also got a situation where the small blind folds, big blind continues. And our last situation is where we play 3 ways, right? Both continue. And how are we going to write that? We know that if the small blind continues, we're looking at 1 minus x. And if the big blind continues, given that the small blind has also continued, right? Well, we don't know what that is yet. Yep, Boomer's got it there. Perfect. 1 minus x times 1 minus z. And you've got z there too. Yep, perfect. Okay, so 4 scenarios. Each of these characterize the probability of being in one situation or another preflop, right? And we've got a few different ones. They're options, right? Now, what if we wanted to break this down even further? You know, what is the probability that the small blind folds when faced with our open raise? This is our variable x. Actually, let's make that our variable name as well. So this is something we can describe, right? We're going to be using this as an input later on. So let's just call this, I don't know, 20%. We'll just give it a number for now. Later on when we create our chart, right, like similar to the charts you see here where we have some cells that we can input information, right, we're going to be making this cell equal to that value. Now, we also want to know what is the probability that the big blind folds given that the small blind has also decided to fold. And this is our variable for y. Let's say he decides to come along 50% of the time. He's defending his blind against our button open raise half the time, just as an example. And our last scenario, right? What's our last scenario here? We want to characterize our variable z, or z if you're American, or some other place. But we're looking at this variable z, and we want to figure out what does this represent? We only look at z in situations where the small blind does not fold, right? Small blind continues. Yeah. What is the probability that the big blind folds given that the small blind continues? Exactly. Boomer's got it. Big blind fold given small blind continues. And this will be represented by Z. And let's say in this situation, we'll call it 15%. But again, we want to be flexible enough where we can, use any number here, right? Any data figure. Okay, so we've got some questions about different symbols, stuff like that. I wouldn't get too bogged down in details, right? There's going to be different points where that's going to be easy to do. But let's just try and keep our wits about us and carry on through them. Okay, well, let's make this chart a little bigger. I have a feeling that we'll need some more space. Okay, so we've already worked out 4 situations. Now, in those 4 situations, what do we need to know, right? Because, we're entering the pot. We've got the probability that different things happen, right? How do we make those probabilities important to us? Right? We've already described the 4 general things that can happen when we open raise, stats, and lots of them. Well, we're probably going to be using some stats at some point, right? We can see here that we need data to put in, and that's going to come later when we get to examples. But what we probably want to do, if we want to make a decision about whether or not our choice to enter the pot is going to be profitable, we're probably going to need to calculate the expected value, right? Now, if we think generally here, The expected value is equal to the sum, so we could just write sum, of the probability of an event, so Px times the payoff, and we'll call it Xn. And this is the general equation that we could use for the expected value. Now, we already see that we have different things that can happen, right? We've got basically 4, right? So what are the payoffs in each of these situations, right? So if we choose to enter the pot and we're in the situation where both players fold, what is the payoff? Exactly. Yeah, 0.75 big bets. In other words, we win the blinds. And let's give that a variable name too. We'll call it B. Seems simple enough. So 0.75 big blinds, we're going to get to a point later on. We'll just call it 1.5 small blinds for now. And I guess it really doesn't matter. 0.75 big bets. And later on, just like these other data figures, right, we're going to be sourcing something else, another table, when we're, calculating this. Okay, so this is situation A, where both players fold, we win the blinds. Let's look at situation B, right? Small blind 3 bets, the big blind folds versus the 3 bet. Now we're in situation B. What's the payoff there? Let's say we win the pot. How much do we win? So we'll call this pot. Let's call it pot A. That might get a little bit confusing, but we'll start with it. And this will be heads up versus the small blind. When we're in this situation, suppose we win the pot, what is our payoff? Anybody have any ideas? You need data there. Yep, we're probably going to need some data for sure. But our payoff is the pot, right? Whatever the average pot is. In situations where we win the pot, that's our payoff. Now, we can also lose the pot, right? So what we can see is that in that situation, our true payoff is really the expected value, right? We're in that situation with some probability, and what we're really going to win is the expected value, right? And that'll be the probability that we win the pot times the size of the pot minus our investment. So we're going to need to know what is the size of the pot in that situation. Well, some of you guys may have been here when I covered small blind re-stealing, right? And there we looked at average pot sizes. You can see them here. When we were faced with an open raise on the button, right, and the big blind decided not to continue, right, the average pot size was 7.25 big bets. So we could put that in, 7.25. And again, we're going to be sourcing these from other tables later on. So let's give our variable a name here. Let's call it C, right? Now, I've already hinted to the idea that we're going to want to look at our investment in the hand. And that's another part of our ability to, or something else we're going to need to calculate the expected value here. So let's put those in. So we can have investment A, similar to pot A, and this will be the situation where we're heads up versus the small blind again. Let's give it a variable name. We'll call it A. And now this is going to be somehow related to the size of the pot here, right? We don't exactly know what it is yet, but we're going to have to calculate that. So we'll come back to that later on. But given that we have this situation where we're looking at the pot, we want to know how often we're going to win the pot, right? We want to know how much it's going to cost us when we're getting involved here, right? Boomer asks here, are we assuming that we never cap? Well, the idea is that we're looking at all the average pot sizes, right? So when you go and look at the amount that you're investing, right? If you choose to cap pre-flop, then your average pot size will account for situations where you do cap, in addition to the ones where you don't, right? We're trying to just be very general. It's kind of simplifying, right? Because we're not going to be looking at, 16 different possibilities. We're just looking at 4, right? And it's still going to get pretty complicated. And if we consider the situation where they both continue, the probability of that is going to be equal to zero point 0.2 times 0.15, which is 3%, right? So we're already accounting for situations that only come up pre-flop 3% of the time, just using these 4 things. If we were to go on and account for situations where, the small blind 3 bets, the big blind cold calls, and we decide to cap versus call, right? We would be looking at, just astronomically small little bits of probabilities. And in the long term, those things do count, they matter, but they're probably not going to have a big effect on our required equity. Okay, so we have our pot size, right? 7.25 big bets. We have the amount that we're going to invest. That's going to be based on this, right? If we think back to small blind re-stealing, there we calculated our investment from the small blind by dividing let's see if I have it somewhere handy. First, we take the average pot, subtract the dead money, and then divide it by the number of players. And then if we've made a forced bet pre-flop, then we subtract that as well. But when we open raise the button, we haven't made a forced bet, so we don't need to do that. So here we could say that our investment is equal to the average pot size. If we're heads up against a small blind, then we know that the big blind has folded, right? So we're going to be subtracting the blinds from this. And why don't we just go ahead and start our second table before we get to that? Because this is all kind of new for me, there are going to be some things that are different that will take a bit of time to sort out. One thing I've been trying to achieve recently is to balance my investment a little bit better with regard to the amount of time I'm spending on prep for the coaching. So we can convert this to a range. We can add more cells later if we need. Yep, go ahead. And let's just say we want to call this button open raising strategy. Try and make this a little bigger. There we go. Now, some of the obvious things we're going to look at, right? We need to know the blind structure. So we could say, what is the size of the big blind? Let's say we're playing at 1-2, so the big blind is going to be $1. And we'll just convert this to $1. We also want to know the size of the small blind. And oftentimes that's going to be half of this, right? Half or a third is pretty common, right? But this is actually something that we might want to play around with. So let's give it a color. It'll remind us later on that this is something we're interested in. So now that we have the blinds figured out, right, we can use that to calculate our investment. We see here that the average pot size is 7.25 big bets. So let's subtract out the big blind because that's going to be dead money in situations where we're heads up against a small blind. Next, we want to divide the whole thing by 2, so we're going to need to put these into brackets. And because we weren't making a forced bet pre-flop, right, we don't need to subtract anything more. So our average investment in heads-up pots, where the average pot size is 7.25 big bets, our average investment will be 3.125 big bets, which is a lot of words. Let's not get too caught down on those. Now let's think about our equity, right? Our equity is going to change a lot, and it's going to depend on our opponent's range, right? So obviously, our equity is going to be something that we'll look at. So let's say we wanted to look at The estimated probability that we win the pot versus our opponent's ranges. And we'll look at, well, maybe each situation, right? We've got X times Y, all these different spots. If they both fold, the probability that we win the pot is going to be 100%. We know that pretty clearly, right? So let's say this is P win versus XY. Just like that. Now we also want to know how much equity we have in situations where the small blind enters the pot and the big blind doesn't, right? This situation here. And this one's going to be interesting because really we're going to need to look at our opponent's hand range, right? We also want to know our equity versus both, right? Now, can anyone tell me here, what are we missing? We have our equity when we win, right? Or the probability that we win when no one enters the pot, 100%, right? We have our equity when the small blind continues, right? We're going to be using that. Our equity versus both players, we'll use that. What are we missing? We've got scenario A, right? We win the blinds. Scenario B, small blind 3-bets. Scenario C, where's scenario D? We haven't put that in yet. Does anybody know why? Well, as you're going to see here, the reason we haven't put that in yet is because we're going to calculate it. This is going to be the thing that we need to figure out. We're also going to be calculating our expected value. This is going to be really useful later on. And we've already started to do a little bit of that. So this variable, this is going to be our output. Let me just paste some formats here to make it look nice. Okay, so what we want as an output is we want to know what is the minimum equity that we can have against the big blind, right? So let's do a few solutions, right? We've got our variable A. We know this is going to be equal to X times Y. This is the probability that both players fold. So we'll take X and multiply it by Y. So the probability that both players fold, I guess that's 20%. Oh, I see why. I put that in wrong. So it's 40%. Now the probability that the big blind or small blind 3-bets and the big blind folds will be equal to 1 minus X, as we talked about. And we're going to multiply that by Z, which we have listed here. And as we talked about already, it's very rare, right? Pretty uncommon situation. And again, I wrote that backwards earlier. Okay, and let's change this to a percentage. Next, we want to look at the situation where the small blind folds and the big blind continues, right? In fact, this is the situation we want to calculate in the end, right? This is going to be equal to X times 1 minus Y. And again, it's going to be 40%. Same as above, really, right? We can see that the situations where they both fold and where the big blind continues are exactly the same. The reason is because his probability of continuing is 50%. Now they both continue. It'll be 1 minus X times 1 minus Z. And this is the extremely rare one, only 3% of the time. Okay. So we have the probability that our opponents continue in different situations. We have the probability of being in one of each of 4 scenarios, right? And then we want to go on and keep filling in our pot sizes so we could have pot B, which is the situation where, no, let me just back this up. I've got some notes off screen here. Situation where we're heads up against the big blind. And pot C. Cheating on the exam, right? Where we are playing 3 ways. And we also want to carry on and keep doing the same thing with our investments, right? Because we want to have our investment for each scenario. And basically, you know, for any strategy that you guys have seen me show you for pre-flop, right? Small blind re-stealing, small blind open raising. This is the exact kind of thing that I do. Okay. Now, last, right, we're going to want to look at our equity in each of these situations. So we could have EQA, right? Let's see if it's going to cooperate. Nope, it's going to use autocorrect. And this is going to be, again, heads up versus a small blind. EQB. And that's heads up versus the big blind. And EQC. Gotta love autocorrect. And here we are 3 ways again. Okay, and these, right, we're going to use from our data over here, right? So let's give these a few names. Let's call EQA, we'll call it variable P, right? For pot B, we can call it, I don't know, S. We'll call this W. Give ourselves some variable names. And this is going to be useful later on when we come around to calculating the expected value. The idea here is that rather than using something complicated like, you know, pot A, right, to symbolize the size of the pot, we'll just use a letter C, and that's going to make things a little more simple pretty soon, actually. Okay, now let's say we want to figure out what is the average pot size when we play heads up versus the big blind, right? This is actually something that I haven't worked out yet. The reason is because, you know, some of these pot sizes like heads up versus the small blind, or even 3 ways when the small blind 3 bets, I actually worked those out before during the re-stealing coaching, right? You can see the when the big blind continues, the average pot size is going to be about 10.25 big bets. So let's just copy that over. But wouldn't it be nice if I could show you guys exactly how to figure that out, right? So I'll load up Hold'em Manager, and we can do that. Hopefully my computer doesn't freak out a little. I'll have a lot of stuff running here in a minute. But in the meantime, let's calculate our investment for 3-way pots, right? Now, if we're in a 3-way pot, that means the small blind continued, right? So we don't have a situation where the small blind is contributing dead money in the form of the, you know, forced small blind. The big blind continued, so the big blind forced bet isn't going to be dead money either, right? So if we want to work out, right, the average investment in a 3-way pot, what would it be? Any ideas here? Yeah, Raf's got it, exactly. It'd be 1/3 of the average pot size, right? So we take the average pot divided by 3. And this is the expected amount that we will tend to invest, right, if all players invest equally in 3-way pots. Now, this is an assumption that we have to kind of make. If we had better information, right, maybe we could improve that assumption. But this is something I talked about during the small blind re-stealing coaching, right, that until we get some better information, until we get better data, I prefer just to assume all players are investing equally. Now, our investment for B is also going to be pretty complicated, right? We're going to work that out in a second here. But if we're heads up against the big blind, right, then we're against two players. So average equity would be 1 divided by the number of players of the pot, 2, right? So the pot size will do the same thing. We can divide it by 2, right? But we also know that there's going to be a bit of dead money, right? Because the small blind folded. So we want to take that out of the average pot, right? So we got our small blind over here. We're going to subtract that from whatever we work out to be the average pot size. And then, like before, we're going to divide by the number of players involved in the hand. Because it's heads up, this time it's 2. Okay, so I've got Hold'em Manager up. Let's pop into reports. Now, the way I worked this out to get an average pot size that seemed relevant to me was to create an alias, right, that had basically every single player that I could find in it, right? And then the next thing that I did was I created a filter. Now, I'm not sure which date range this is. Let's go to all dates. Basically, this is a lot of different players in my database. Hundreds of different aliases, I'm sure. And now what we want to do here is we want to go into filters. If you're confused about the number of hands or the data, that'll make a lot more sense in a minute. So we want to look at situations where we're facing an open raise and our raiser is coming from the button. So in Hold'em Manager 2, you can go into filters and select the raiser's position, the button, right? And then we want to select the hero's position. We're in the big blind, right? Because what we want to do is look at the average pot size when faced with an open raise where soft flop equals true. The reason why soft flop equals true is important is because if we're looking at average pot sizes when our opponents continue to the flop, right, we also want to be looking at the average pot size from our data where that's true. So we've got one raiser. The raiser's position is the button. We're in the big blind. We click OK. And in a second here, we're going to get to see what the average pot size is. Well, it looks to be about, this is in dollars, I believe. Oh, no, it's in big blinds. Okay, that makes more sense. So this will be 13.58 divided by 2. 6.79 big bets for the pot. Okay, and now this is the average pot size, right, when we're heads up against the big blind. It might not be exactly accurate, right? Have you got whole cards filtered there? Yes and no. I've got whole cards filtered because we know our opponent decided to see the flop, right? And we also know we're up against an open raise. So both players are going to be having a hand range which is defined by their decisions, right? But we don't exactly have, you know, the spot where all whole cards or we haven't filtered down the whole cards in any way. Okay, so until we get around to looking at hands, that's all the time I'll need Hold'em Manager for. I'm going to close that up. And automatically we can see this is updated, giving us our average pot size. Now our equity, we know we're going to source that. EQA will be versus the small blind. Put that there. Heads up versus the big blind, this is the one we want to calculate, so we'll call it an unknown, right? That's the thing we want to figure out. EQC is our equity 3 ways, right? For now it's 0. Let me just see if I've got all our variables, and I think we do. Now this is a good sign. So here we have, let's just back this out a little. Something like a dozen different variables listed here, right? And all of these we can use to calculate the expected value of our decision to enter the pot, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the expected value is equal to the sum of the probability of all of the events that occur multiplied by the payoff when each one occurs, right? So let's use some of these variables and try and work that out. Now we'll take the expected value and we'll make that equal to, well, what is it equal to, right? So the expected value is equal to the sum of the probability of each event multiplied by the payoff, right? We've already listed that we have four different things that can happen. Event A, B, C, and D. So let's take A, right? And we'll multiply it by the thing that happens when we're in situation A. Well, when we get into situation A, we'll be playing for the expected value of, let's just call it X. Like that. And so this is going to be equal to the expected value of situation A. Well, we'll get to that in a minute too. To that, we're going to add the probability of being in situation B, right, which we have represented by the variable B. And we're going to multiply that by the payoff when we're in that situation. In this case, we'll call it the expected value of situation A, where we're looking at pot size A, investment size A, and equity A, right? To that, we're going to add our situation C multiplied by the expected value of being in the pot size B, where we've got the investment size B and equity size B. And to that, we're going to add our fourth situation, D, where we multiply the probability of being in that situation, which is only 3%, as we talked about, and it's going to be the EV of C. Now, you can see we've boiled this down pretty far, right? And we haven't even gotten to a point where we can look at the question that we want to answer, which is how much equity do we need against the big blind? We know that's going to be some part of the expected value of B, right? So let's just break this down even further. We can say EV equals A times the blinds. We'll call it B, our big B, plus B times, I'll make a few small changes here, just so I remember later on. There we go. C multiplied by E. And to that, we're going to subtract our investment, right? This is our cost of playing the hand. So we want to know, right, the expected value of playing the hand against a small blind is going to be equal to the pot size multiplied by our probability of winning the pot minus our investment, right? So in this case, our investment is signified by the letter P. And I've tried to write it out here where it says just simple small words. So we're in situation C. We want to multiply the pot size, S, times the probability of winning the pot, which is the equity in that pot, which is E. And to that, we're going to subtract our investment, which is T, right? And then the fourth one will be in situation D. Apparently, I'm dyslexic today. And we'll be multiplying our pot size, C, right, which we have signified by the letter W, by the equity in that pot, which we have signified by I, and we're going to subtract our investment, which in this case is signified by N. So here we have the expected value calculation that's kind of general, right? We're looking at situations where we win the blinds. We're looking at situations where we're playing heads up against a small blind, heads up against the big blind, and then three ways, right? Now the variable we're most interested in is this one here, right? So what we want to try and do is solve this equation for that variable, right? And more than that, we want to look at this equation in specific situations because we want to know whenever the expected value is equal to 0, right? If we're looking at the break-even point, what we're most interested in is situations where the expected value is 0. So if we take this equation, now we're going to play around with one of my favorite tools online. We can go to this computational site called Wolfram Alpha. If you guys don't know anything about this, feel free to check it out if you enjoy silly things like I do. And we're going to take our equation. Let me just add in a few multiplications here. Wolfram Alpha can be a little bit picky sometimes. Okay, And like I said before, right, what we want to do is we want to solve for E, right? And this is going to be representing our minimum required equity. So if you're not very good at algebra, as I'm not, right, what we can do is try and find things that will help us solve some of these online. So we just click calculate, this little equals thing over here. I'm not going to give a full tutorial on Wolfram alpha, but it is very handy. And what it does is it goes through, sometimes it makes assumptions. Oh, it's assuming that the I is an imaginary unit. I don't think it's going to make any difference. No, it looks fine, but let's just turn this I into a J for now so it doesn't get confused. Okay, and you can see here we've got this equation. We've got E, which is our minimum equity, is equal to this thing, right? So if we use our variables, right, and calculate this out, what we will get is the minimum equity that we need for those situations, right? Very general, very powerful. So let's break this back down. Let's go the other direction, right? What exactly are we looking at here? Well, E is represented by the required equity, right? So we can put that in. Well, we know A is equal to when they both fold, right? And B is equal to the blinds. So negative A times B is actually going to be equal to the probability the small blind folds multiplied by the probability the big blind folds, given that the small blind's folded. To that, we're going to multiply it by the blinds, right? Negative A, this whole thing in here is A, times B, the blinds. Let's go down a line. The next line we've got negative B times A times C, this, which is the negative of B, which is the inverse of the probability the small blind folds. In other words, the probability he continues. And we're going to multiply that by the probability the big blind folds, given that the small blind has decided to continue. So that is B, right? Our little letter B. We're going to multiply that by A, which is our equity in pot A. And we're going to multiply that by C, which is just the pot size for the situation A. Let's move on to the next one. We've got this little b times P, right? Now, what does that stand for? We can see some of our variables here. We've got P being investment A, so that should show up. And we've also got the little b, which we just saw, right? So again, it's going to be the same thing as above, except now we're looking at the third part of our expected value calculation, the investment, right? Let's move on. We'll look at the next part. We're looking at C times T, little c times T. Well, C we haven't looked at yet, but we know it's going to be represented by X times 1 minus Y, which is a situation where the big blind or the small blind folds, but the big blind continues, right? This is the chance that we're in a heads-up situation against the big blind. So that's going to be represented by probability the small blind folds times the inverse of the probability the big blind folds when the small blind folds, right? And to that, we're multiplying this thing T, which is the investment we make in that scenario, right? You can see it right here. Let's move on again. We're on to this D times IW. So we're going to be subtracting the probability that we're in scenario D, which is 1 minus X times 1 minus Z, which means we're looking at the inverse of the chance the small blind folds. So the small blind's continuing. And we're looking at the inverse of the chance that the big blind folds. So the big blind is also continuing. This is our three-way pot, right? This is the chance that our opponents continue, both of them. We can see it's only 3% given our assumptions. We're going to multiply that by our equity in that situation, right? And then multiply the whole thing by the pot. Let's move on. We're looking at D times N. So we know we're in situation D once again, but we're looking at now the investment for that situation. And because it's easier, we'll just do the next two lines. We're also going to add in CS here. But we've got D, which is this, right? D is the situation where we're three ways, and we're multiplying it by our investment in three-way pots. And then we're going to divide the whole thing by C times S, which is the probability that we're playing heads up against the big blind divided by, or multiplied by the pot size, right? So this is this equation, right? This equation right here is all of this, right? But we've just broken it down in a way where we're looking at every single small variable. So in other words, if we want to calculate the required equity, we need to calculate each of these, right? We've got about 7 different small calculations before we do a big one. So let me put this down here for now. I'll kind of get it out of the way. Okay. So if we want to calculate what this is, we need 7 different things. Let's just number them. Oh, that's +2. Okay, if you guys have any questions along the way, I'm more than happy. We could take a 5-minute break from me kind of going through this, and we can answer some questions. But let's take a look here, right? So what is this scenario? Well, what we're really looking at is negative a times b, right? Maybe I'll move this to where it's smaller. Yeah, that's better. So this is negative a times b. That's going to be the first one. Next one we want to look at is negative b times ac, right? After that, we're going to calculate b times p. Then we'll go on. We'll keep going through our equation as we've got it written up here, right? Right up here. Zoom in, please. If you guys are looking at, if you just use your scroll wheel, you can zoom in yourself if there's things that you're interested in. Could you see this formula as the table after the coaching? At the end of the coaching, my plan is, in the next 20 minutes, half an hour, is to actually look at some specific scenarios where we can go through some examples, right? The reason I wanted to build this from the ground up was just to show you guys exactly what goes into this, right? And I am recording today. You'll have a chance to look it over. So hopefully that'll help. But yeah, if you want to zoom in on anything that we're looking at, you can do that using Join Me. Just use your scroll wheel and you can zoom in on anything. Okay, so part 5 of this equation, we've got negative d times IW. And you know, one of the reasons why I like to calculate these individually is because using Excel can get a bit tricky with all the brackets and stuff like that. And quite frankly, I don't want to do that. Okay, so negative a times b. We've got a up here, right? So we're going to be making this equal to negative this times the blinds, right? That's it. That's the first part of our equation. Next, we're going to be looking at negative b, right, times a, wherever it is. There we go. And we're multiplying that by c, which is right here. Right now it's 0, right? Well, the reason it's 0 is because our equity hasn't been defined. Let's say we just decide to put in some equity here. We'll put in 50, 45, right? Now, automatically, these are changing, right? You can see it's updating. And these numbers will update too. Now, this is a good thing because it means we can just put in, right, the amount of equity that we have. We know how to calculate equity. We just put in our hand range, use something like Equilab, right? And we'll get to this later on. But you'll see that once we have this developed, right, it becomes very easy to calculate all kinds of situations. So next we have B times P. Normally, what I would do for these is actually do all this in advance, right? Maybe there's some good reasons for that. Maybe there aren't. But I like switching things up a bit too. The next line down, we've got C times T, which is right there. Our next row, we've got negative D times IW. Negative D, all right, situation where they both continue. Pretty rare, just that 3%. Multiplying that by I, which is our equity in three-way pots. Multiplying that by the pot size, 3 ways, which is W. Next one down, we've got D times N. Well, we know what D is, right? We just talked about it. And N is our investment in those 3-way pots again. And to all that, we're going to divide C times S, which is the situation where the big blind continues against our raise, which is C here. And S is the pot size, I believe. Yep, there it is. Pot size versus the big blind. So we've got our 7 different things. Open office is good. Yeah, either one of those is great. Okay, so we can use all of these, right? And we can use them to calculate our required equity. So what we want to do, we can just sum these up, right? The first 6 lines, right? Just like that. And what we're doing is we're taking all these and adding them up, right? And then we're going to divide the whole thing by this last one, CS, right? You can see it here in the denominator, right? So we've got the whole numerator added up, dividing it by the denominator. And it looks like we've got a small mistake somewhere. Perhaps. It might work itself out once we get more of the data in there. But I expect little things to come up. And worst case scenario, I can just show you the finished job that I've got on the other screen here. But we've got some more information that we want to put in, right? In particular, we want to put in our opponent's range sizes, right? In fact, we want to know the rake too. Let's put in the rake. Let's say it's 4%. Let's change these to percentages as they should be. Oh, that's probably why. Yeah, this is assuming that we're looking at 50,000%, but it's just 50 and 45. That's going to help. Yeah, much better now. Okay. And the rake percentage, we're interested in that too, right? It's not 400%, it's just 4. We're also interested in the effect that position has, because obviously if you have position, that matters. We've talked about that before. Now, the way I've worked out position is by looking at the average difference in win rate by position, right, for thinking players. And then I compare that to the rake paid in big bets. So average difference in win rate by position was 2 big bets per 100. The rake that I paid was around 3.3 big bets. This came up in the last video as well. But, you know, 2 big bets divided by 3.3 is about 2.4%. Let's just get some zeros in here. Pop that out. There we go. We also want to look at villains, right? Our opponent's range sizes. Let's center this. There we go. Now, when the small blind, now let's see here. Big blind's heads up range. Yeah, let's start with that one. So what's the probability the big blind continues? What's his range size? Heads up versus our button steal, right? This is also something we're going to want to play around with. We'll have a few like this. So let's say he continues 50%. We talked about that before, right? And now we can actually update this information, right? Rather than having this say what it is, we could just make it equal to this cell here, right? This table is what will really change later on. Say what's the small blind range versus the button steal, right? This is the probability that he chooses to 3-bet us. Defending 50%. Oh, 50,000%. Yeah, that's a lot of hands. I'm not sure we're dealt in that often. So small blind, let's say he continues 20% of the time, just as a rough figure, right? We can narrow that down once we start looking at our opponents, right? Once we actually have an example of a player. And the third situation, how often is the big blind going to continue when the small blind re-steals, right? And we'll call that 15% for now. And what we can do is we can update each of these now. Equals 1 minus. This will be equal to 1 minus probability that he continues, right? And this one's going to be equal to 1 minus the probability that he 3-bets us. So again, we're calculating all these figures so that we could just put in, let's say we've got a massive fish in the big blind and he's continuing like 85% of the time, right? You can see automatically that our equity is changing. This is a good sign. The more variables we get in here, the more useful this is going to be. For instance, right now, we don't even have the rake or position factored, right? Now, one way we might want to think about calculating the effect rake has is we know that any pot size we stand to win is going to be discounted by the amount of the rake. So if we multiply the average pot size by 1 minus the rake percentage, so we're going to make it, what would it be in this case, 96% of its original size, right? Then we're going to have this size pot. And if we do a fancy little thing like that and drag this down, we can get at the rest of the pot sizes, right? The average pot size, heads up versus the big blind, after we account for the rake, is going to be a little bit smaller, right, by the effect of the rake. So if we change the rake size, let's say we make it huge, 50%, well, all of a sudden, these are half the size they should be, right? But it's not 50%, as we know. Still pretty high, 4%, but that's what it is. Now, there's other things that we might want to change, right? Our investment. Now, our investment tends to change by the effective position, right? We can see that position advantage is worth about 2.4% of the pot. So if we're in position, that means our investment in hands that we lose is going to be smaller, right? Because we're able to make better decisions by having position. So what I like to do here is we multiply this, we subtract the pot size times 2.4%. So we're subtracting out 2.4% of the pot, right? And here again, we can do some fancy little stuff with Excel and then drag this down. Let me just make sure that's correct. Yep, we're good. Now, if we wanted to, we could even go through and update our minimum equity, right? So that all of these numbers down here that we calculated actually use the numbers where we were accounting for the rake. Let's see if I've got any more little stuff to do before we switch over here. No, all right, well, we've got about 25 minutes left, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch over, and we'll look at the table that I created beforehand, because we've basically gone through all the steps, but there's a few more small ones. Let's just open that up. So these are the charts that I prepped beforehand. You can see we've got all our variables. It's a little bit different the way I did it initially, right? But we've got our X, Y, and Z. We've got our 4 scenarios. We've got B for the blinds. We've got our different pot sizes, CSW. We've got our equity in each spot, AEI. And then we've got the investments, PTN, right? We use all that to calculate our minimum equity, which is down here. So let's just recreate that scenario. And we can actually look at the difference between when we don't account for position in the rake and when we do. It's only a small change, but still very useful. Okay, so we're looking at the big blinds continuing half the time, like we said there. So we're looking at 30% equity roughly. Half 2015, okay. Bring up the charts. Half, small blind, 3 bets, 20%, big blind range of 15%. Okay, so now we've got our chart ready, right? And we can look at these situations. The minimum equity in this spot seems to be about 38%. I've also got the expected value. And what I've done here is I've calculated the expected value using the minimum equity. As we should expect, it actually works out to be 0, right? Because like before, we were looking for the break-even point. When I was showing you guys this equation up here, we wanted to solve where the expected value was equal to 0. We were solving for our required equity, in this case, variable E. And you can see here we've actually gone through many of these steps here. We've solved for required equity, right? We've created our expected value calculation to do so. We've also listed a ton of variables, right, all up here. These are all of our variables. We've collected data to fill these in. And we also have some assumptions, which are probably worth talking about. Now, these are the same assumptions that I've used repeatedly, right? The first one is that all players are equally skilled. The second is that our equity in the hand is our probability of winning the hand. Now, this one's not exactly true, right? And in fact, none of these are true. You know, the players aren't going to be exactly skilled. Our equity is not the exact probability of winning the pot. You know, our hand range's equity matters too. In other words, our weaker hands tend to benefit from the stronger hands in our range. Another assumption here is that all hands play for the average pot. And the fourth one, I'll just put these in. Okay, so those are our assumptions, and these are really important because without them, we really can't do this kind of mathematics, right? We can maybe try to make other adjustments later on, but they're really required for us to make these decisions. So let's open up Hold'em Manager 2 again, and we'll look at some hands, right? We'll look at hands where we're open raising the button, and we're faced with different opponents. And here you can start to see, you know, just how light we can actually justify open raising. I mean, if you consider this scenario, we've got a guy in the big blind who's continuing half the time, pretty typical for tight tags, right? Small blind who's 3-betting 20% of the time, still pretty typical, and in some cases more laggy than a lot of players do. And then the big blind, we're assuming he continues 15% of the time, and already we only need to have 38% equity against the big blind's range. 40 average. Hey, Raf, so when you say 40 average, is this the amount that you expect we're going to open raise from the button, our range size, that we'll be raising about 40%? Because you might be a little surprised here in a minute. There's going to be situations where it's correct to open raise that often, right? Based on the assumptions that I've made, right? But what we'll see in a minute here is that we can actually, as long as we play excellent post flop, right? Because we're going to be in some pretty marginal spots, we can actually see some more situations. I'm not exactly sure how many hands are actually loaded into my normal alias. By normal, I just mean completely average, right? But it's a lot. It's a ton of hands. Okay, so we want to filter again. And in this case, we're going to be looking at situations where we are on the button. Oh, I've actually made a small mistake here. When I looked up the average pot size earlier, right? I actually went to saw turn, so we're actually going to have bigger pot sizes than we should have. Let me just get the data that I calculated earlier. So I'll just use my own reference. But really what we should have done earlier when we created this filter is done saw flop equals true. That's what I wanted to look at. But here we can just look at any pre-flop scenario. It's also important, you notice here I've got between 3 and 10 players when we were looking at the button open raise. The reason for that is I didn't want to look at situations where we were heads up and the button was actually the small blind. So when we're filling out our variables here, first thing we want to do is look at the blind structure. It looks like I'm playing at a 25 cent, 50 cent limit, which means this is from the coachings. And so we can make this equal to that divided by 2.5 because it's 40% of the size, and we'll make this 0.5. So we've got 50, 20. Oh, that's not even quite right. It's 0.25. There we go. And the rake at these stakes is 4.5%. Position advantage remains the same. So let's say we want to know how likely is the big blind going to continue if we open raise. Well, I don't have a lot of hands on this guy, only 52. And actually over this sample, he's been folding a lot. Against a small blind open raise, he's folded 100%. Against an open raise overall, it's 83. So that's pretty big. But, you know, we would probably want to look at something more average, right? So the way we could do this is similar to the way I looked at player profiles for the small blind re-stealing coaching, where we group a lot of tags together and get a big sample. If I had to guess, I would say players are probably continuing about 55% of the time. Maybe this tag, right? He might be a bit tighter than that. We'll see. Now, the small blind, we need to figure out how often he's going to re-steal here. I've got 255 hands on this guy, and he's re-stealing about 14%. Now, this doesn't surprise me because he's kind of a tight tag. I think that 15% is going to be pretty accurate for him. So let's stick with that for now. 15% there. And the big blind, we worked this out before when we looked at re-stealing. We worked out that versus a 3-bet, a tag tends to come along about 15 or 16% of the time. Let's say it's 16. Okay, so we have our probabilities, right? These are all calculated based on these values. Down here we have the average pot sizes, right? For all the different situations we can be in. We also have our equity. That's probably the next thing we want to work out, right? We've got all this filled out. Down here, we want to look at our equity. So what's our equity versus the small blind's range? Well, we can figure that out pretty easily, right? We can basically look at the top 15% of hands. There's some changes we may want to make here, right? Like our opponent might be 3-betting with some more playable stuff. Hard to say exactly what. Maybe something like this, right? And maybe even King 10, not Queen 10. Hard to say. It really depends on the players. But let's go with this for now. So he's 3-betting us about 16% of the time, 15, 16%. We have King Jack suited, right? So the first thing we do is we calculate our equity against his hand range, right? We can see, let's use numerate all. That'll give us a quick number. We can see we've got 43.5%. Equity versus the small blind, 43.5. Now we want to put our big blind on a hand range, right? We thought he was going to continue about 15% of the time as well, except now he's probably more inclined to not play these weak offsuit hands and more inclined to play, suited hands, stuff that plays a little better. So we can open this up a little bit differently. Something like that. We can make small changes in there too, and that would be kind of a separate topic, putting our opponents on a hand range. Now what we want to do is change this to Monte Carlo, otherwise it'll take forever. And we can calculate our 3-way equity, right? Equity versus both. We can see we have 29%. Oh, where did that go? Okay, 29.2. Now what we can see here, right, is that to justify an open raise, we need to have above 39% equity against the big blind's hand range. We said that he's continuing 55% of the time up here, right? So let's deselect these two, right? And we'll give the big blind a hand range to continue against us, whether it's by calling or 3-betting. Again, we want to put in more suited hands than offsuit ones. And again, we can make small changes in here, right? There's lots of different ways we can look at this. We're saying that he continues about 55% of the time. So the last thing we do, right, in order to figure out if we have a profitable raise, is to see if we have the minimum equity. And in this case, we're crushing, right? King Jack suited is such a clear raise, it's not even close, right? Let's look at something much more marginal. Let's say we have 7-6 suited, or even 7-6 offsuit. That's probably a better one. Now, our equity in each situation is going to be much different. Our equity versus the small blind, against both, and even against the big blind. So let's go back through, right, and just look at the same scenario with a weaker hand, right? And essentially what we're trying to figure out, once again, is the amount of equity that we need in situations where our steal attempt fails, right? Most hands are going to be in an awesome situation if both players fold. That's really what you want to see. So 7-6 suited, or offsuit, sorry. We've got 31.9% equity against the small blind. He's got us crushed, right? When this guy chooses to 3-bet with his 15% hand range, he's got us crushed every time, right? Against both players, we're going to be in the same situation. It's going to be terrible for us, right? We've got 23% equity against both of them. So we put that in here, right? Now what we can see is that if we've got 32% against the small blind and 23 against both, we need to have 43% equity against the big blind's hand range. So in order for 6-7 offsuit to be a profitable raise, we've got to have 43% equity against the big blind. Do we have it? Right? The question kind of answers itself, you know? And immediately, a marginal decision, a decision some people think is correct, do we raise 6-7 offsuit on the button, is clearly not correct, right? If we put in the amount of equity that we actually have here, 36.1 basically, we can see that we're losing about 10 cents per hand when we choose to play this, right? We can even look at other spots. We've got 5 minutes left here. So I'm not exactly sure of the best way to wrap up from this. We can keep going through examples. If you guys have some last questions, feel free to get them in, and we can go over a little bit, maybe. We'll just make sure we get through each of these things. I understand that the way I've gone through this today is probably the most complicated approach, right? Because I didn't do any of the work beforehand, right? We just went through it from beginning to end. And what I was hoping was that this would show you guys exactly what goes into this. 7-6 suited against the open raise, we're going to have more equity than before, about 3% more. 35.6, 30.4 basically. Let me see here. Equity versus both, we can figure that out again. Again, it's going to be slightly better, right? We've got 26.5 now. Now the question is, right, does this hand being suited improve our equity enough here? We can see that improving our equity in each of these situations has actually bumped up the minimum equity we need, right? Before we needed like, what was it, 43% or something? Slightly more than this, right? So it's dropped. The reason it's dropped is because our equity has increased. Let's say we made it like 50 there and like 60 here. We can see that our equity decreases even more. But the closest situations are going to be ones where we have close to average equity in each spot. Okay, let's see. Boomer says, I'm wondering if we could even go deeper based on hand types, i.e. certain hands that are more likely to develop huge pots. Yeah, we absolutely can. Hands that are playable, right, tend to outperform the equity that, you know, pre-flop suggests, right? Because, you know, they flop strong draws that you can sometimes play for value, or flop monsters that can be well disguised, like a small pocket pair when it hits a set, right? Not to say that small pocket pairs are generally very playable, because most of the time you don't hit a set. It's only about 12% of the time, right? But yeah, you're absolutely right. We can look at that. Once we develop this, right, there's tons of things we can look at here. One thing that I find very interesting is once we figure out how to decide how often we want to raise based on how often our opponents get involved, right, we can start to solve for the optimal range size, right, based on our assumptions. So, you know, I looked at small blind re-stealing. We can use that information over here to try and solve for exactly how much we want to re-steal against a guy that's open raising the button with a solid hand range, right? And then if we went even further, we could look at big blind versus button open raising and then use all three of those to try and gradually solve, you know, pre-flop from that situation. Squat says German DSL sucks. Sorry to hear that, sir. Never fun to have internet problems. All right, so our last thing, do we have the equity to open raise with 7-6 suited at 25 cent, 50 cent, right? That's an important part too. So we bring back in the big blind's hand range that we chose earlier, this 55%, right? Just like that. We click evaluate. We can see that we're getting pretty close, 39.5, right? This is one of those hands, like you talked about, that's pretty playable, right? If we put in 39.5% equity here, we can see that we expect to lose 3 cents per hand, which it's 3 cents. That doesn't seem like a lot, but actually 3 cents is kind of irrelevant. It's going to be a percentage of the total pot that we're more interested in, which would be the total average pot, which I don't have that number, but it's a small percentage, right? So given that 7-6 suited is pretty playable, right? You can flop strong draws. Maybe this is the kind of hand we still want to play, right? We're in a close situation here, though. We could look at some other ones, right? Because what I have a feeling that at least some people in the coaching today are not comfortable open raising a hand like 9/8 suited, right? We're going to have similar equity in lots of spots, right? From the button under the gun. Yeah, if you want to mix up your hand range, then you can definitely have some uh, some hands that skew the way your distribution looks. But right here, all I'm looking at is value raises. So equity versus small blind, we've got slightly more. Equity versus both, we can work that out. Again, it's slightly, actually less in this spot. Now, we can see that we have slightly less equity than 7/6. Part of the reason for that is probably going to be because we're dominated by a lot more of our opponent's hand ranges. And that's something you'll see too. It's very rare, though, that a hand will end up being playable because it's dominated by one range, because usually you're doing well against the big blind's hand range, as 9/8 suited will be. So we need 42% equity. I can even bump this out, get some more decimal places. We've got over that. So this is a profitable raise, right? If we put in 42.9, we can see that we're making about 2 cents per hand when we choose to play this, right? And this assumes all players are equally skilled, right? It means we're not any better than our opponents, right? We're not any worse as well. Is 9/8 offsuit profitable? We can look at that for sure. And see, this is the interesting thing, because once you have these charts, all kinds of pre-flop decisions become very easy to answer, right? Is this definitely profitable, right? And we can answer those questions very simply. So we've got 32.7, already not looking too great. I mean, the small blind's hand range has us crushed. When the big blind continues, we've got 22.6, right? But again, we're only looking at tags, right? We're only looking at two tight aggressive players. If we decided to look at fish instead, this would change drastically. First of all, the first thing that would change is we would need more equity against the big blind's hand range to open raise, but it would be easier to have, right? So even though we would need more equity, we actually would get there much quicker because they have like such a big, weird hand range, right? So we need 42.8% equity here, heads up against the big blind. Let's calculate that. We can see again, we're getting pretty close, right? Now it's also worth looking at some of our assumptions. Now, if we look back here, one of the big assumptions that I make is that all hands play for the average pot size, right? What that means is that we are assuming a hand like 9/8 offsuit, if we chose to play it, it would be investing the same amount as aces, kings, right? All those big hands that we're comfortable playing big pots with, right? That's just not true. It's just not, right? And what that means, the net effect of that is that our hand range on the button, if we followed this strictly, would be tighter than optimal, right? We could say that for sure. But in reality, lots of tight aggressive players already play too tight, right? Even the poker strategy button open raising chart that they suggest for new players, it's only 37%, right? Very tight. Now, if we started quizzing through and looking at, okay, what's the weakest king high we could play? What's the weakest queen high? Should we be playing 9/8 offsuit? Probably, right? 9/7 suited, right? 7/6 suited, it's a very playable hand. There's reasons why these hands are in there, right? Even though they don't have the equity, mostly because they're very playable, because they give us a harder to understand hand range, right? Pocket twos, and we could literally keep going down. I expect that we could very regularly end up with a 50% range. And this is looking at bad rake, right? If we change the rake, let's say we look at 2-4 and above, right? Where the rake is 3%. That's going to make a big difference. We've already dropped basically 1%, right? Yeah, the blind structure is bad too. Let's say we make this, 1/2 again, right? And we'll make this 1-2 just to make it easier. It doesn't really matter what we make this, right? Because it's just a unit. But we can see our equity has dropped even more. Now it's 40%, right? Let's say we've got a tighter guy in the big blind. This makes a big difference too. Let's say he's like a super nit, not the nits we've seen so far. Small blind range versus the button steal. Let's say he's stealing 8% of the time, always 3-betting. Now our equity is only 38%, right? So what we can see here is that the probability that the small blind decides to enter the pot plays a big role in how much equity we need to have against the big blind when we work this out, right? Um, you know, what this would also mean is that we have less equity against him, so we would have to change that. Maybe we would have just 29% equity or something, right? And you can see it's very dynamic, right? These things are all very interrelated. So that's all the time I've got for today. We're going to have to wrap this up quickly. Next week, when we come back on, we can look at some of these things again if you guys are interested. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I hope it wasn't too dry. I knew that going through each of these small steps would require you guys to stay really focused. So I appreciate that you guys have done that. And thanks for all the questions. So take care, guys. I'll see you later.